Welcome to the Abel Speaks Podcast, where we speak to commonly asked questions by parents who have received a life-limiting diagnosis for their child. We're Daniel and Kelly Crawford, and we're glad that you've joined us. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Abel Speaks Podcast. We are excited about this next sequence of episodes because we are going to be emphasizing what we call the caregiving component of this journey that oftentimes parents will experience, that we talk often in the context of Abel Speaks of choosing to carry a child with a life-limiting diagnosis, that there is a potential for time outside of the womb to look limited and shorter than any parent expects. And yet we say often, if you've hung out here any length of time, that there is a broad spectrum of what that time outside of the womb can look like. And so many of our parents with life-limiting diagnosis will have the opportunity to take their child home and to have the ability to caregive for them. And so what that looks like is typically not straightforward. You know, having a medically complex child changes things, and yet we haven't really featured that aspect on the podcast yet. And so we're going to have a couple of guests here coming up to share their stories and their experience with their children, as well as just speak to some of the aspects and components of what this journey has looked like for them. And so first up, we are going to send this thing remotely to Tennessee, baby. And we're going to talk to the Mussers. And so we've got David and Katie. And so really would love to just start by hearing at a high level, just tell us a little bit about your caregiving journey so far with Izzy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today. We are honored to get to share a bit of our story. About 2.5 years ago, I was midway through my third pregnancy, and my anatomy scan wasn't looking so great with the baby. Things were just, she was growing smaller than they were expecting, and a few other noted pieces to that ultrasound. And so that led to a series of appointments to then determine that the pregnancy was at high risk. I chose not to get genetic testing, actually, so I didn't know if there was any sort of underlying diagnosis or if this was just an anomaly situation. So at delivery, we were choosing to kind of live in the hope that baby was just growing small. We'd be in the NICU for a few weeks and we get to go home. Day 2 of little Izzy's journey and life on this earth, I had the geneticist come into my postpartum room to tell me that there was some pretty significant concerns for multiple chromosomal disorders. And so she explained what those were. That same day, actually, Izzy started having seizures and then was needed to be put on some level of respiratory support. So I still wasn't quite sure what the diagnosis would be. But a couple of weeks later, they confirmed that she had full trisomy 18 and that we weren't really guaranteed how long she would be with us. But that was 2 weeks into the journey already. And she was doing well, although needing some medical support. And then week 3 of her life, she had a pulmonary hemorrhage, which was significantly life-threatening. She almost died. And praise God, was able to live through that experience. And 5 weeks into life, had a heart surgery and a G-tube placed for feeding purposes. And 49 days into her life post-delivery, we were released from the hospital, and the journey continued and continues for us. And certainly not a dull moment has passed since all of the initial hospital stay for us, with lots of specialists and lots of medical care from home as well. But that's a bit of our journey so far with Izzy.
Yeah. Do you guys feel like because you didn't have a formal diagnosis, do you think that changed the first 2 weeks of like care from just like the hospital side of things? Like, do you think they were more open to providing some of the services than they might have been otherwise? Or do you feel like they would have been open even if they knew the diagnosis?
Yeah, I would say that most of our medical providers were pretty confident it was trisomy 18 or 13, but based on some of the phenotypes they were noticing externally with her. So they were, thankfully, we were in a hospital that was very friendly to trisomy diagnoses, and she was getting the appropriate care they needed, and it didn't feel like they were giving her less than what she needed because of a potential diagnosis.
And Izzy's 2.5 now?
Yeah, she just turned 2 in November.
Just turned 2. Okay.
That's awesome. And so this feels like something that could be its own like hour-long episode, but did want to ask like just what have been some things that you guys have been learning, some things that Izzy has taught you, some things that being her parents has impressed upon you. And again, it's like you want to be a little more specific, bud, but I'll keep it broad on purpose if there was just a few quick things that come to mind.
Yeah, I think, man, there's so much that we have learned from Izzy that she continues to teach us. She's a fighter for one, so it's really easy to look at a diagnosis and kind of set her own limitations, but she's showed us time and time again that she's a lot stronger maybe than we even think she is. And we have learned to just take it a day at a time. Like, what is she doing today? And let's go with that, with where she's at right now. And I think kind of on a spiritual side, it's opened up a lot of like, what does that journey look like with sorrow overlapping with joy? Like that can be the same situation, and I can feel just immense sorrow and deep joy. And there's just been an aspect of holiness that we have like been privy to that I don't think we would have felt through any other situation. So partly is like Izzy is totally content, and yet she's totally dependent. But so there's this aspect of like, how does God see us as his children, that like we're totally dependent, and yet we get so stressed about what are we doing tomorrow, right? All the things that can really make life hard. And she has all those things working against her, and yet she's smiling and laughing 99% of the time. And so really just opened up like how God is as a parent to us, and how, I don't know, it's opened our eyes to that in a new way as well.
That's awesome. And I think what you touched on is important, because especially in the context of folks that maybe have been tracking with Abel Speaks, that, a lot of the time there's more limited time outside of the womb with one's child, whether that's a trisomy diagnosis or whether that's any number of other life-limiting diagnoses. And so on the one hand, looking at y'all's journey and looking at Izzy's life and the fact that she has and continues to exceed these expectations, there's this sense of like, wow, like that's, something we talked about, thought about, prayed about, as we were pregnant with Abel and anticipating what his life would look like, would be like, great. He Izzy is surviving. She's living. She's defying the odds. And what a blessing, what a joy that is to get to continue to love her and have her and parent her and cherish her. And yet you also alluded to that there's its own form, not in the sense of loss of life, but in, there's a sense of loss, a sense of grief, a sense of, hey, and because God has entrusted this little girl to us to parent, our life looks a lot different in a way that isn't always super convenient and super easy and super simple. And so I think we'll probably speak to that maybe more in depth in a separate episode to just really unpack that more. But can you give us a little more, of that authentic picture into like, hey, yeah, here's some aspects of what our life looks like as we're taking things one day at a time. That's a real challenge, and that there are aspects of our life of what it looked like 2.5, 3 years ago, the Mussers, versus today. A lot's changed and a lot's different. Anything else you would share in terms of like, hey, what's been hard about that? To then also be able to circle back and ultimately say what I know I've heard you say already, which is, we wouldn't trade her and wouldn't trade this experience for anything. But
yeah, I mean, virtually every aspect of our life has changed. Like we were both working full time prior. Now I'm staying at home, homeschooling with the older kids as well, to provide that flexibility, taking Izzy to and from appointments, dealing with therapies. Katie shifted her job to be in the home. So that's just high level. Like we were making this much money. Now we're making this much money, right? And there's an impact there. Then we're also looking at moving currently to a state that can help offset some of that financial loss. They pay a family member to be a caregiver. So that's shifting a whole nother dynamic. And then largely, like you mentioned, the loss is kind of the loss of the dream. Like 2 weeks before Izzy was born, we met with the missions director about going overseas. And then once Izzy was born, that whole diagnosis, we're like, that's not even on the back burner. Like we're just turning the stove off. Like we don't even know. That's clearly just not the direction at this time. And then it's a day-to-day thing. So I was dropping something off at a friend's house recently, and they were all loading up. I'm like, oh, where y'all going? They're like, oh, Little Rock for the day. And it was just this moment of like, not that I've ever wanted to go to Little Rock, but like, I know I can't just pack up for a day trip to drive 2.5 hours with the family. And so just this loss of spontaneity, and everything has to be planned and synced and organized. And to just leave the house is a huge deal. To do it all together is a rarity. And that's just a piece there.
I think my question is like how, I'm sure there's like a wrestle there, like as Daniel said, it's like any parent that gets a diagnosis like this, like our hope, right, is that our child lives and we get to parent them for longer than 15 days, which is what we got with Abel, but then like, and so we're wrestling with the fact that we didn't get to do that, right, with the Lord. But like, what does the wrestle look like? And is that day to day for you guys, week to week, month to month, in terms of, navigating, hey, those are things that we don't get to do anymore, or the aspects of our life that we're having to shift, and really just, I think, lay down and like trust him with, what does that look like for you guys as you navigate that?
Yeah, caregiving has been a journey of surrender. That's exactly right. There is a constant lesson, maybe hourly. We used to say day by day, we'll take it day by day. Now it's hour by hour. Sometimes it feels minute by minute. But this lesson of not fearing the future. And so let me stop. I'm going to step back, because what I want to say is not fearing the past and not dreading the future. And so there's this element of what has happened in the past has been hard with her already in 2 years. And there's a potential for it to be the same hard or even harder. And of course, the dread of when is the day that we need to let her go. And so it's a constant surrender there, where I'm having to learn to live in the present. And then the fight of looking around me when you're in places of suffering, the rest of the world doesn't stop for your suffering, right? It just keeps going on. And so we have to face the realities that we have friends headed out to Little Rock spontaneously, and those things of like, okay, that's not what our reality is. And we get to be okay with that. And that is a wrestle between the Lord and us, and sometimes between us and marriage and with our other children. There's a lot of tension that can happen, and it's very refining and very sanctifying. And I don't know how else to do it other than relying on the sovereignty and sanctification of God, who has been so gracious to bless us with his presence in these really, really hard moments.
Yeah, I think that was really beautifully said. And I would maybe conclude with one last question, which is just if there's parents listening right now, they're maybe early in their caregiving journey and they're still wrapping their minds and their hearts around, like you said, what the road might lay ahead, what that might look like and feel like. What are just a final sentiment or two that you would leave them with?
Yeah, I think one thing that has really carried us is kind of this idea of like lament through worship. So when Izzy was in the NICU, I actually brought my guitar in. I would lead worship at home, and I said, can I just bring it in? And I had hours a day where she was hooked up in tubes. She may not be able, couldn't hold her as much sometimes. And I would just play worship songs over her. And really for us, and it was such a source of strength and peace, just kind of doing hymns. And it became like a mark of that NICU. Like all the nurses were fighting over our pod. They wanted the dad that was playing guitar for his kid. And then that's just kind of carried. So I think for us, it's just been a tremendous source of strength on those those low moments where all you see kind of is the storm around and all the challenges and things trying to happen. Just shifting in perspective from the storm to the creator of the storm, the one that recognizes the storm voice, right? And then that becomes a sense of like, okay, there is a storm here, but that doesn't change who God is, who he is to me, who he is to Izzy. Like, and there's just a sense of tremendous peace then that kind of can wash over us in some of those moments that are the hardest or scariest.
Anything you would add to that, Katie?
No, I think just that, not fearing the past and not dreading the future and just trusting God in the present has been a really big lesson and an anchor.
It's definitely wrestling, though. That was a great word. We're back and forth on that different days. It's easier to trust sometimes than others. It's a fight.
Yeah. Something too that you said earlier, just of like, taking life a day at a time and trusting the Lord, or even sometimes an hour at a time. I think even in our, 15 days with Abel and 9 months in the womb, I think that's something, a huge lesson that God taught us through Abel's life is just to rely on him one day at a time, which we see is like such a gift, and also goes against every part of our flesh, right? Like, I don't want to do that. I want to plan and I want to know what's coming, and I want to be in control of what's coming and all of those things. But I do think there's something vulnerable about just taking life a day at a time. And I think something that really requires a lot of trust in the nature and character of God, which is hard, but also a huge gift. And so I think that's and even now, there's seasons where we almost long for our like season with Abel, which was so difficult, but also just allowed us to rely on God in a way that in our life, 8 years removed from his life, it's like, oh, well, I kind of do have control over my day, right? In my mind, that's like not reality, but that's how we can navigate life. And so I do think amidst the hard, the gift that it is of like, no, I literally have to trust God for this next hour, for this next day, is we often say like if I was God, Abel would still be here, but also the redemptive aspects of just the sanctifying elements, the way the Lord used his life to sanctify us, I guess, are a huge gift. And that 1 hour, 1 day at a time piece is a part of that. So.
Yeah, and it's a gift that you can receive, but also one that then you can extend and give to others. And so I would say thank you to you guys, just even on that sense of the vulnerability of what a gift to our listeners to hear from you guys, and not just get to hear Izzy's story and what her journey's been like so far, but also just hear from your hearts and hear, hey, here's the good, here's the hard, here's the sweet, here's the sorrowful, here's how our lives look different now than they ever would have. And yet, here's where we are honored and privileged to be her parents and to be her stewards. And so you guys are doing a heck of a job. And it's been a gift to us to have y'all's friendship and have y'all's partnership in this ministry capacity, and forever grateful to Abel and to Izzy for allowing our families to overlap. And so much more to come from the Mussers as we speak to more kind of thinly sliced, really practical elements of their caregiving journey, but wanted to start there high level, just getting to hear from them. So thank you guys for sharing, and thanks everybody for tuning in to this episode of the Abel Speaks Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Hey friends, thanks for listening in. We hope this content has been helpful. At Abel Speaks, we exist to support families who have chosen to carry a child with a life-limiting diagnosis, and we want you to know that the foundation of that support is rooted in relationships. And so if you're a parent in this circumstance, then by all means continue listening in, but we'd really encourage you to reach out by sending an email to support@abelspeaks.org. Again, our heartfelt prayer is that this episode has served you in some way, and that we might have the opportunity to serve you further in the future. The Abel Speaks podcast is produced by the team at Sound of a Rose.